November 11th, 1943, 21:47 hours, 6 miles west of Rabaul. The moon is nothing more than a thin smear of silver behind drifting clouds, and the ocean below is a pitch-black void. Only the soft hum of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine cuts through the night. Inside the cockpit of an F4U Corsair, Major William G. Sasvoig, Gus Hargreaves keeps one gloved hand on the throttle, the other lightly tapping the radar scope that flickers like a heartbeat. A faint green blob pulses at the edge of the display. Contact. He doesn't say a word. He doesn't need to. The night is his ally, his camouflage, and his weapon. You can almost feel the chill of that high-altitude air seeping through the cockpit glass, mixing with the smell of warm oil and cordite residue. The Corsair's massive propeller slices through the dark like a buzzsaw, and each vibration feels like a reminder. Tonight someone is going to die before they ever see their killer. 500 feet below and a mile ahead, 3 Japanese A6M Zeros drift across the sky in perfect formation, unaware that a predator has slipped behind them. Their pilots sit relaxed, confident, maybe even smug. For years they dominated these skies. To them the Zero is untouchable, and the American Corsair? A joke. A clumsy steel brute with bent wings and heavy controls, good for daylight brawls at best, and hopeless in the dark. But the enemy hasn't yet learned that the night has changed. Hargreaves leans forward, studying the scope again, memorizing the drifting green echo. The onboard AN/APS-6 radar, the Corsair's new secret, gives him eyes where nature offers none. No moon, no horizon, no silhouette. Just the pulse of the hunted. A quiet breath. A subtle nose-down adjustment, and the Corsair begins its descent toward the night-blind Zeros. He flips the safety off his wing-mounted 50 cal Brownings. The first Zero drifts into his gun sight, blissfully unaware. And yet, before Hargreaves squeezes the trigger, before the sky erupts in tracer fire, we jump back in time. Because this moment, this hunt, this reversal of power, didn't begin in darkness. It began with laughter. 18 months earlier, on a sun-blinding Pacific afternoon, Japanese Navy pilots gather around a chalkboard map on the flight deck of the carrier Zuikaku. The briefing officer points to a crude sketch of the newly reported American fighter, a huge, awkward-looking machine with inverted gull wings and a barrel-thick fuselage. The pilots stare, then smirk. Lieutenant Masao Sato, one of the sharpest Zero pilots in the unit, lets out a low whistle. Kuroi same, he jokes. A black shark? Someone shakes their head. Too graceful a name. Another pilot, grinning, suggests something more fitting. Koe Kusumushi, a scary dung beetle. Laughter echoes across the flight deck. They mock the silhouette of the Corsair. The bloated nose. The ridiculous wingdip. The long landing gear. The sluggish climb rate in naval intelligence briefings. To the Japanese aviators, the A6M Zero is still the king of the sky, sleek, agile, graceful, and tempered by years of combat. The Corsair, by contrast, looks like an engineer tried to cram a battleship engine into a tin can and bent the wings to make it fit. No wonder they scoffed, no wonder they underestimated it. At this early stage, even American pilots had their doubts. Newly delivered F4U units complained about visibility, tricky landings, and unpredictable torque. Some Navy squadrons refused to operate them from carriers entirely. Everyone knew the Corsair had speed, but speed meant nothing if the pilot couldn't harness it. So the legend formed, the Zero danced, the Corsair lumbered, and the mocking spread from pilots to maintenance crews to briefing rooms. But soon, very soon, the laughter would sour, because while the Japanese pilots joked, the Americans were quietly solving the Corsair's problems. They tuned the engine, modified landing gear, redesigned the canopy, and above all, they found pilots who could master the beast. And one of them was Gus Hargreaves. When Marine Night Fighting Squadron 532, VMFN 532, was activated, no one fully understood the weapon they were about to unleash. Radar-equipped fighters were still experimental. Night combat was practically witchcraft. The Navy had been trying to merge airborne interception radar with single-engine fighters, but the electrical interference alone was enough to make instruments twitch like possessed needles. Hargreaves didn't care. If the engineers could make the technology work, he would fly it. And if he could fly it, he could kill with it. Early training took place in the blackness above Hawaii, where the night sky looks like an endless dome of ink. Pilots trained to fly by feel, not sight. They learned to trust the pulsing green radar returns and the voice of ground control intercept stations. They practiced the art of positioning, sliding into a target's blind spot, climbing beneath its silhouette, where even starlight couldn't catch the glint of a canopy. Marine aviators joked that they were becoming sky ninjas. Hargreaves didn't joke. He trained his men like stalkers, silent, disciplined, methodical. He told them that daylight dogfighting belonged to kids, night fighting belonged to hunters. They won't see you, he said. They won't hear you. They'll never know your name. And every pilot nodded. But even then, even with this specialized training and radar technology, one thing was certain. There was no point hunting unless the prey believed it was safe. The Japanese did. By mid-1943, Rabaul was the beating heart of Japanese air power in the South Pacific. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, nearly every mission launched from its volcanic perimeter. Zeros at Rabaul were experienced, confident, and deeply familiar with the terrain. They knew how to dive through cloud layers, how to use the mountains to shield themselves, how to strike Allied raids with perfect timing, and most importantly, they owned the night. Japan had no reason to develop night fighter tactics. They didn't need them. The Americans rarely flew after dark, and when they did, navigation errors and accidents killed more pilots than combat ever could. So Rabaul slept comfortably. Its pilots relaxed at dusk. And while American units scrambled for blackout tents, the Japanese drank warm sake under lanterns and told jokes about the Clumsy Corsair, until rumors began. It began with reports from lookout posts on Bougainville, unexplained tracer fire in the night sky, burning aircraft falling into the ocean, wreckage discovered with no known attackers identified. Then a bomber crew returned shaken, claiming they saw gun flashes from a single-engine fighter at night. Their comrades laughed. Everyone knew the Americans didn't have night fighters. But 2 weeks later, another crew reported the same thing. Then a third. Then 6 fighters vanished on a routine night patrol, none sending a distress call. Something was out there. Something hunting. The Japanese command at Rabaul chalked the events up to weather, faulty engines, training accidents, anything but the truth. And yet, every night more planes failed to return. One intelligence officer suggested perhaps the Americans were using P-70 Havoc night fighters. Another dismissed it. Those were too slow to catch Zeros. Corsairs? Impossible. The Corsair could barely land safely in daylight. But the impossible was already stalking the skies. Night of October 30th, 1943. A Japanese reconnaissance Zero climbs steadily into the stars, its pilot humming under his breath. He adjusts the throttle, lets the rhythmic drone of the Nakajima Sakai engine settle. No enemy is expected tonight. This is routine. Then, in the corner of his eye, a faint spark. He frowns. Before he can turn his head, the spark erupts into a horizontal storm of .50 caliber fire. Tracers rip through the cockpit in a blinding line. Glass shatters. Fuel ignites. The Zero explodes in a silent blossom of orange flame, lighting the clouds for half a second before snuffing out. Far above, Hargreaves pulls the Corsair into a climbing turn, radar sweeping for his next target. He says nothing. There is no celebration, no triumphant shout, just the calm breathing of a man who has found his role. The next night, another Zero vanishes. Then 2 more. By the end of the week, Japanese pilots refuse to fly certain patrol routes. They whisper to each other about a ghost plane, a machine that sees in the dark, a machine that kills before it can be seen. Someone claims it has the wings of a bent demon. Someone else claims it moves without sound. Someone else swears he saw the silhouette, a huge, hulking monster with a shark's head. A Corsair. Mockery turns into uncertainty. Uncertainty turns into fear. And fear, in war, spreads like fire. By early November, the nightly losses are impossible to ignore. Rabaul's command finally sends teams to examine wreckage. Charred Zero fuselages show clear patterns of .50 cal hits from below and behind, angles impossible for American bombers or patrol craft. Someone suggests experimental radar. A few officers laugh. That laugh doesn't last long, because the next night, an entire 6-plane patrol disappears without transmitting a single warning. 6 aircraft, 6 trained pilots, gone in under 10 minutes. Japanese command finally admits the unthinkable. The Americans have a night fighting unit. It is effective, and it is likely using those clumsy Corsairs. The mood in Rabaul's briefing rooms shifts. No more laughter. No more jokes. They spread new orders. Patrol in pairs. Change altitude constantly. Avoid flying straight and level. Descend immediately if radar interference occurs. But none of it matters, because the enemy isn't hunting at random. He is hunting with radar precision. He is hunting with discipline. He is hunting with the night. And he is coming again. And now we return to where we began. November 11th, 1943. Hargreaves's crosshair settles on the lead Zero below him. The radar echo grows stronger, brighter, deadly confirmation. He squeezes the trigger. The Corsair's 650 cal Brownings erupt, illuminating his wings in strobing fire. Tracers pour downward like molten metal. The lead Zero disintegrates instantly, bursting into flame. The other two panic, breaking formation, climbing wildly into the dark, which is the worst possible choice. Hargreaves rolls left, throttle forward, radar pulsing, the Corsair climbing like a predator tasting blood. He locks onto the second echo. The green blob stabilizes. He fires again. Another Zero spirals into the abyss. The third pilot flees, diving toward the ocean, engine screaming. But darkness is unforgiving. He has no radar, no wingman, no horizon. He vanishes. Hargreaves doesn't pursue. No need. The message is already clear. 9 minutes, 3 kills, 0 losses. And tomorrow Rabaul will wake to another empty row of fighter slots on the roster. The balance of power is shifting. The night is no longer safe. The Corsair is no longer a punchline. And the Japanese pilots know, somewhere out there in the darkness, a bent-wing hunter is waiting. But they have no idea just how much worse it's going to get. Because the Americans are about to introduce something new, something even deadlier, something the Japanese have no counter for. The fires from the falling Zero hadn't even reached the surface of the Bismarck Sea when a coded transmission flashed across Allied channels. It was short, clinical, almost cold. 3 confirmed, returning to base. Hargreaves. He didn't include a single detail. No boasting, no adrenaline-fueled triumph, just the facts. That was the thing about night fighter pilots. When the world goes pitch black, the ego goes quiet. On the deck at Banneker Field, mechanics loitered under dim lamps, listening for the distant rumble of a returning Corsair. Night operations always carried an edge. A missed approach in the dark could erase even the most flawless kill streak. But tonight, as the radar hut confirmed the inbound aircraft, men stepped out of workshops and tents, eyes turned skyward. Someone muttered, "That'll be Gus," and no one corrected him. The black shape broke through the coastal haze, barely visible, a shadow over deeper shadow. Landing lights flicked on, dull and yellow. The Corsair floated in on a shallow glide slope, wheels brushing the pierced steel runway with a screech. Major Hargreaves rolled to a stop, canopy opening with a hiss. Warm island air flooded in. The ground chief climbed onto the wing, expecting a story. Hargreaves simply removed his headset and said, "Fuel her, we go again tomorrow." Inside the makeshift operations shack, lit by wobbling lanterns and a single generator-powered bulb, the squadron's intelligence officer had something new spread across the table, something the pilots had never seen before. A photograph, blurry, grainy, snapped by a reconnaissance lightning earlier that day. It showed a Japanese airfield just north of Rabaul. Nothing special at first glance, rows of parked aircraft, maintenance hangars, the usual. But in the corner, under a canopy, sat something unusual. A Zero with a boxy housing mounted on its nose, wires dangling, technicians poking at it like confused surgeons. The pilots leaned in. Hargreaves squinted. "What in hell is that?" The intel officer tapped the photo. "Radio detection equipment. Their guess is radar." Someone laughed. "Oh, they're trying to copy ours?" "Trying," the officer repeated, "and failing." The room quieted. For the first time, the Japanese were reacting. They weren't mocking the Corsair anymore. They were scrambling to understand it. But it wasn't just the tech. It was the tactics. The Japanese command structure had relied on an assumption. Night equals safety. But now, night meant something else entirely. Night meant uncertainty. Night meant fear. Night meant the enemy could be above you, behind you, or already lining up the shot, and you'd never know. And the worst part? The Americans were just getting started. The next morning, as the tropical sun climbed through a haze of low clouds, VMF N-532 assembled on the runway. Sweat ran down pilot necks even before the briefing began. Hargreaves stepped forward, not with swagger, but with that precise, focused energy his men had grown to respect. "Listen up," he said. "Command wants results. We gave them results." A few chuckles. He didn't smile. But the Japanese aren't stupid. They're adjusting, so we adjust faster. He pointed to a chalkboard diagram, crisscrossing lines, labeled arcs, altitude changes. "This is the new intercept pattern. The ground radar brings us within 2 miles. After that, we switch to silent running. No radio, no lights, no formation. We fight like wolves, individually, hunting the weak spots." A young lieutenant raised a hand. "Sir, what if we lose the radar echo?" "Then," Hargreaves said, "you trust your instincts." Another pilot pressed. "And if they get radar?" Hargreaves paused. "Then they still need to learn to use it." A murmur swept the crowd. Truth was, even American night radars were finicky, sensitive, glitchy. Sometimes a stray radio broadcast would scramble the entire display. The idea of Japanese technicians cobbling together a similar device on a jungle airfield? Not a threat. Not yet. But Hargreaves knew better than to underestimate an enemy that once owned the sky. Which is why he had a new plan, one he hadn't shared yet. That afternoon, Hargreaves took his XO, Captain Delmar Del Watson, up for a demonstration flight. The 2 Corsairs formed up side by side, each engine rumbling like a dormant storm as they climbed into blue sky. At 8,000 feet, Hargreaves keyed his mic. "You see the problem yet, Del?" Watson glanced across the shimmering air. "Which one?" "The Zero can't beat us here," Hargreaves said. "Not anymore. They climb slower, they dive worse. They can't make up the energy." Watson frowned. "But they're not meeting us here. They're meeting us at night." "Exactly." A pause. "And that's why we win." Hargreaves rolled his Corsair inverted and dove. Watson followed. The 2 fighters streaked downward, wind howling against their canopies. At 450 knots, Hargreaves pulled up, sharp, deliberate. The Corsair arced into a perfect climbing turn. Watson watched, impressed. The Zero, lightweight, floaty, agile, was built for tight turning fights. But at night, those advantages became liabilities. A Zero pilot couldn't risk high-G maneuvers without visual reference. Couldn't trust the artificial horizon under heavy stress. Couldn't snap roll without risking instant vertigo. Meanwhile, the Corsair, heavy, stable, powerful, could dive and climb in the dark with far more confidence. Its radar gave it the positioning. Its rugged frame tolerated sudden accelerations. Its massive engine could yank it out of danger. The Corsair's supposed weaknesses became strengths under the stars. "Del," Hargreaves said, leveling out, "we've been thinking about this wrong." "How so?" "It's not that we're hunting them." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It's that they can't fight back." November 14th, 2 days after the triple kill. On the Japanese side of the lines, anxiety had seeped into everything. Briefings, maintenance shifts, even mealtime conversations. At Tabera Airfield, a junior pilot named Ensign Hiro Matsuda walked the flight line with beads of sweat running down his neck. The afternoon sun shimmered off the metal skin of the Zeros, but Matsuda wasn't looking at their wings or engines. He was looking at their shadows. Night was coming, and with it, the hunters. Matsuda turned to his flight leader, Lieutenant Sato, the same man who once joked that the Corsair looked like a dung beetle. "Sir," Matsuda whispered, "what if they attack again tonight?" Sato adjusted his gloves, pretending calm. "Our instructions are clear. We climb to 8,000 feet, change altitude every 90 seconds, maintain loose formation, and if they see us before we see them?" Matsuda blurted. Sato didn't answer. No one had an answer. because no tactic could save you when the enemy saw through darkness and you didn't. That night, VMF N-532 launched a coordinated three-plane operation, Hargreaves, Watson, and Lieutenant Kermit Buck Hughes. For the first time, they had a clear objective: strike a Japanese night patrol before it could disperse. A bold move, a dangerous one, but Hargreaves believed they were ready. They climbed through slippery cloud layers, instruments glowing dim green. The radio crackled once, then fell silent. Only the hum of engines filled the cockpit. At 14,000 feet, Watson's voice finally broke across the channel, picking up interference. "You seeing this, Gus?" Hargreaves checked his radar scope. Static, just a little, but unmistakable. The Japanese were jamming. Not effectively, not fully, but jamming nonetheless. "They've adapted faster than expected," Watson muttered. Hargreaves tightened his grip on the throttle. "It won't save them." The radar interference fluttered. Then, a clear echo. 2, then 3. The patrol. Hargreaves banked and descended, letting gravity accelerate the Corsair. A Zero appeared dead ahead, black against black. Hargreaves fired. The night erupted. Watson struck next, cleaving through the formation with precise bursts. Buck Hughes dove beneath the chaos and climbed up behind a fleeing fighter, punching holes through its fuselage until it exploded in a violent flash. 3 kills in under 2 minutes. But something was different tonight. As the last Zero fell, Hargreaves noticed something glinting beneath its wreckage, small pieces of metal fluttering down like silver leaves. Wiring, copper, scraps of a modified nose cone. Proof. The Japanese were absolutely trying to build radar-equipped Zeros, and that meant one thing. The night war was officially escalating, and it would escalate fast. Back on base, engineers swarmed the debris Hughes managed to photograph. Their eyes widened, their voices grew urgent. They found evidence of Japanese tinkering with captured American radar manuals, likely from downed bombers. Found crude frequency coils, amateurish antenna arrays. But also something far more dangerous. They had nearly succeeded. Their device didn't work consistently. It overheated. It jammed itself. It blinded their own instruments. But it was improving. Quickly. Hargreaves stared at the report, jaw set. If the Japanese managed to field even a partially functioning radar fleet, their pilots could avoid ambushes, could scatter, could survive long enough to adapt new tactics. The Americans' biggest advantage would shrink overnight. He folded the report. "Dell," he said, "we push harder, no letting up." Watson nodded. "How hard?" Hargreaves looked out at the dark runway. "Hard enough to break them before their radar works." The next evening, just as the sun slid behind the volcanic ridges of Rendova Island, a courier jeep screeched to a halt beside the squadron's operations tent. An officer jumped out, clutching a folder marked "Top Secret." He wasn't smiling. He wasn't calm. He wasn't carrying routine orders. He was sweating. And when he spoke, the entire tent fell silent. "Gentlemen, we've intercepted Japanese communications." He swallowed. "They're preparing a counterstrike. Not just a patrol, not just a scramble." He handed the file to Hargreaves. "This one is big." Hargreaves opened it. His eyes narrowed. Because the Japanese weren't planning to defend the night. They were planning to take it back. And their plan, if successful, could wipe out the entire night fighter advantage in a single devastating move. But what exactly were they preparing? And how would the Americans counter it? The canvas flap of the operations tent snapped in the wind as Hargreaves stepped outside with a classified file still clutched in his hand. The sky above Banneker Field was turning the color of deep seawater, blue fading into ink. Mosquitoes hung in clouds around the lanterns. Mechanics worked with muted urgency, tightening bolts and checking ammunition belts under dim hooded lamps. But the air felt different tonight. Thicker, heavier, charged. Watson approached, boots crunching on coral gravel. "What is it?" he asked, nodding at the file. Hargreaves didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened it again beneath the lantern glow. Inside were intercepted transmissions, translated from Japanese naval code. The words were tight, clipped but unmistakable. Concentrated night operation, multiple squadrons. Objective, saturate enemy radar and crush night attacks at their source. Watson exhaled sharply. "They're coming here?" Hargreaves shook his head. "Worse. They're coming for everything: bombers, supply ships, ground installations, a full-scale night offensive. A night offensive from Japan, something that had never once happened in the war. Watson ran a hand through his hair. You think they're desperate? They're terrified, Hargreaves said, and a terrified enemy can be very creative. He closed the file. The Japanese weren't simply responding. They were retaliating, and they meant to turn the night, their former sanctuary, into a killing field again. 2 hours later, while the squadron prepared for an intercept mission, a strange phenomenon began creeping across their radar screens. Static. Not the usual gentle fuzz from atmospheric interference, but a harsh, pulsing distortion, sharp bands of white noise that flickered like lightning storms inside the scopes. Watson leaned into the screen, eyebrows knitting. That isn't weather. Corporal Rhodes tapped the side of the radar console, brow furrowed. Sir, I've never seen interference this strong. It's like something's jamming, Hargreaves said. They're jamming us. But how? Rhodes whispered. They barely got their sets working. Hargreaves didn't respond because deep down he already knew. They didn't need perfect radar. They only needed to blind ours. The Japanese were broadcasting raw, unmodulated pulses across multiple frequencies, crude, sloppy, and dangerous even to their own aircraft, but powerful enough to scramble Allied ground radar. A brute force solution, the kind of idea a desperate commander approves in the 11th hour. Hargreaves exhaled. They're trying to force us into the dark without our advantage. Watson frowned. Then what do we do? Hargreaves snapped his helmet chin strap in place. We go anyway. Minutes later, 3 Corsairs roared into the night. Hargreaves in the lead, Watson on his right wing, and Hughes trailing behind. The world below them was swallowed by darkness. No streetlights, no torches, just an occasional glint along the coastline where moonlight brushed the waves. Hargreaves tapped the radar screen. It flickered like a dying candle flame. Worthless. Without radar, the Corsair was still fast, still tough, but blind, nearly as blind as a Zero pilot. They climbed through a layer of warm, rising air that buffeted the aircraft like invisible hands. Clouds drifted in slow sheets above them, reflecting faint starlight. Watson's voice crackled through the static-filled link. This is suicide, Gus. Only if we let it be. Hargreaves eased the throttle forward. The Corsair surged. Suddenly, a faint flash to the north, then another. Heavy flak bursts, but not American. Hargreaves narrowed his eyes. They're firing above the clouds. Why? Hughes asked. To signal their own aircraft, Hargreaves said. They're coordinating formations with flak patterns. A crude system, but effective. Somewhere above the clouds, Japanese fighters were massing. Hundreds of them. They broke through the cloud tops at 17,000 feet, and the world transformed. The upper atmosphere glowed with moonlight reflected on endless white cloud plains, smooth as snowdrifts. And against that pale backdrop, dozens of dark specks crawled across the sky. Zeros, Bettys, Vals. An entire composite strike group. Hargreaves felt the hairs on his neck stand upright. He had never seen this many Japanese aircraft in one place at night, ever. Watson's breath caught in the mic. Dear God, a formation like this, if it reached the Allied bases, could annihilate everything on the ground. Radar stations, fuel depots, aircraft, pilots sleeping in canvas tents. This wasn't a counterstrike. This was an attempt to erase the night fighters entirely. Hargreaves clenched the throttle. Stay low, he said. We hit the center and scatter them. And if they spot us? Hargreaves' eyes locked onto the nearest formation. They won't. Not until it's too late. The 3 Corsairs dropped into a shallow dive, picking up speed until the airframe hummed with pressure. The moonlight flashed along their bent wings. Hargreaves lined up on a V-shaped cluster of Zeros, escorting a squadron of Betty bombers. The Japanese pilots were scanning the horizon left, right, down, but never up. He slid in behind them, perfectly positioned, perfectly unseen. He squeezed the trigger. 6 50 cals erupted with a thunderous roar. The tracers cut through the night in a blazing downward arc, shredding 2 Zeros instantly. One pilot never even turned his head before the rounds tore through his cockpit. Watson opened fire on the right flank, dropping another. Hughes dove under the formation and came up shooting, punching a hole through a bomber's wing. The swarm buckled. Confusion rippled through their formation like a sudden shock wave. Pilots panicked. Formations broke. Voices screamed across enemy radios. "Techie! Techie! Enemy! Enemy!" Above, Hargreaves looped upward, climbing into the moonlit glare. Every Japanese pilot in the sky suddenly knew the hunters were here. Japanese tracers ripped upward, curving through the darkness like fireflies on wild trajectories. A Zero streaked past Hargreaves, guns blazing, but he rolled, dove, and let the attack pass harmlessly behind. Watson called out, "Two on my tail." Hargreaves didn't need radar. He spotted the faint shadows closing in behind Watson, the faint glint of starlight off their wing tips. He nosed down and fired a long, controlled burst. 1-0 detonated in a fireball. The second broke away. "Thanks, Gus," Watson said, breath ragged. "Keep moving. Don't let them box you." Below them, Hughes chased another bomber into a descending spiral. The Betty's gunners peppered the sky blindly with machine gun fire, but Hughes stayed just outside their arcs. And then, one clean burst. The bomber dropped like a stone. The Japanese counterstrike was breaking apart, losing cohesion. But then, something new happened. Something that neither Hargreaves nor any American pilot had seen before. 3 Zeros suddenly flashed upward from below the main formation, climbing steep, impossible angles, their engines screaming, not blindly, not in panic, but in perfect coordination. They weren't chasing individual Corsairs. They were intercepting attack vectors. Hargreaves' eyes widened. "They're predicting our passes," he whispered. "They knew we'd strike from above." Watson cursed. "They're adapting." No, not just adapting. They had built a tactic specifically for night attacks. A layered formation with a hidden reserve below the main body, waiting to ambush any attacker diving in. It was smart, deadly, and almost worked. Almost. Because the Japanese still lacked one thing. They could anticipate the angle, but not the timing. Hargreaves broke hard left. The ambush flight shot past, guns blazing at empty sky. He lined up behind them and fired. Another Zero fell burning. But the message was clear. The Japanese weren't just reacting. They were evolving. As Hargreaves climbed back into the fight, something caught his eye, something enormous, a shadow moving across the moonlit cloud deck. Slow, massive, barely visible. He blinked. No, not just one. 4, then 6. Transport silhouettes. No, too large. Then a realization hit him like a gut punch. They weren't bombers. They weren't transports. They were searchlights, mounted on converted transports, pointed upward, waiting. As the swarm of Japanese aircraft retreated toward this formation, the trap snapped shut. Every searchlight fired at once. A dozen brilliant white beams stabbed into the sky, slicing through the darkness and illuminating the clouds like daylight. Hargreaves's cockpit flooded with blinding white light. "Jesus, Gus! They lit up the sky!" Watson yelled. Hargreaves shielded his eyes with his arm. The Japanese had created an artificial sunrise, a sky-wide illumination wall, enough to silhouette every Corsair within miles. Their trap was complete. The night was no longer their ally. The hunters were suddenly exposed, and hundreds of Japanese pilots were turning toward the light. The counterstrike had begun, and Hargreaves was right in the center of it. February 1944, Green Island Airfield, 2100 hours. The jungle hummed with insects and distant surf, but inside the dimly lit marine operations tent, the only sound was the low buzz of a generator, powering a strange, bulky device sitting on a workbench. Its surface gleamed under a single hanging bulb. Wires ran everywhere. Small vents ticked with heat. With Major William G. Gus Hargreaves stood over it with folded arms, brow furrowed, not in frustration, but in fascination. The ANAPS-6, the first compact airborne radar system the Marines had ever seen, and it was his. Captain Janney ran a hand across the smooth metal casing. "This thing feels like it belongs on a battleship, not a plane," he muttered. Gus didn't answer. He traced the outline of the scope with his eyes, the glowing green sweep that would soon become the heart of their night hunts. The engineers explained quickly, nervously, as though they were introducing a weapon to someone who already knew how to use it. "Detection range, roughly 5 miles. Cone width adjustable, can pick up fighters, if you angle the dish right." Gus touched the screen. 5 miles in the dark is an ocean, he said quietly. To them it'll feel like 5 seconds. Outside, the silhouette of an F4U Corsair loomed in the moonlight, a beast of bent wings and brute power. Until now, strictly a daylight predator. Tonight that would change. The Marines rolled the radar unit across the dirt, guiding it toward the waiting Corsair. The ground crew worked in tense silence, bolting mounts, aligning cables, adjusting power feeds. Every spark of a wrench, every thump of a toolbox felt like history being welded into place. Hargreaves climbed the ladder to the cockpit. He paused halfway up, taking in the shadows around him. The runway lights dimmed for blackout conditions. The dark canopy of the Pacific sky, the distant thunder of surf-hitting reef. "If this works," he whispered, "we own the night." Janney called up to him. "You're really going to test it alone?" "Of course," Gus replied. "If it blows up, at least we'll know not to use it." He sealed the canopy, the cockpit swallowing him in familiar metal and leather and darkness. The smell of oil and ozone filled the air. He powered up the radar. The scope flickered. A faint hum vibrated through the cockpit. Static, then a steady sweeping arc. It looked alive. It felt alive. Gus eased the throttle forward. The Corsair lumbered down the runway, tail lifting, wheels rattling over rough coral strip. Then weightlessness, the climb, the night swallowing him whole. Below, the island shrank into a cluster of faint yellow pinpricks. Above, the stars were silent witnesses. The radar sweep pulsed rhythmically in front of him. Gus adjusted altitude, banked left, scanned the horizon. Then a blip, small, distant, moving. His heart kicked. It worked. It actually worked. He banked toward it, the Corsair rolling like a massive feather in the dark. The blip grew brighter, clearer. A target. An aircraft. He pushed lower, closing the gap. Then the moon broke through the clouds for a single second, casting a pale beam across the sky, illuminating the unmistakable silhouette of a Ki-49 Helen bomber returning to Rabaul. The Japanese crew never saw the Corsair, not once. Gus aligned his guns, breath steady, fingers poised. He didn't fire. He only shadowed them, studied them, learned how close he could get, how blind they were. And when he broke away, climbing back into the darkness, he smiled for the first time all night. The Zero pilots had mocked the Corsair. They had called it clumsy. They had called it crude. But none of them had seen what he had just seen. None of them knew the night was changing. None of them understood that the Americans had found the key. Gus landed smoothly on Green Island, canopy fogged, hands trembling with adrenaline. His crew ran toward him, faces expectant. "Well?" Janney asked. Gus stepped down, wiped the sweat from his brow, and pointed at the Corsair. "That thing," he said, "just turned the lights off for the Imperial Japanese Navy." War had shifted, silently, irreversibly, and the Zeros had no idea what was coming. The first night they went hunting, even the air felt unsure of them. February 1944. The moon over New Britain was only a thin smear of light, barely enough to silhouette the jagged edges of the Baining Mountains. Beneath it, Major William G. Gus Hargreaves eased his F4U Corsair into a slow climbing turn, letting the darkness swallow him whole. Inside the cockpit, the glow of the early generation radar set pulsed like a heartbeat. A faint arc. A blip. Then nothing. Then the blip again, steady this time, moving, alive. Hargreaves didn't smile. He only leaned forward slightly, as if that inch might let him see through the night. His wingman, First Lieutenant Frank Janney, held formation just off his left quarter, his silhouette almost invisible except for the flicker of exhaust from the Pratt & Whitney radial. Below them, Rabaul, Japan's fortress in the South Pacific. A cauldron of anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and Zero squadrons that had ruled these skies for years. Tonight, that rule was about to crack. Radar operators at Green Island had already vectored them toward a strange cluster of contacts launching out of Rabaul's Lakunai airfield. Japanese pilots, confident, experienced, and utterly unprepared for what was coming, were climbing to intercept the usual Allied reconnaissance flights. But these weren't reconnaissance planes. They were wolves, At 14,000 feet, the radar blip jumped again, strong, steady, closing in. Hargreaves whispered into his mask, "Jenny, we've got a single bandit heading northeast. Angels 1-5. Let's ride." The Corsair's nose dipped slightly as he advanced the throttle. The aircraft surged forward, its massive prop biting into the humid Pacific air. The night pressed in tight around him. No horizon, no depth, just the feel of vibration through the seat and that pulsing radar trace drawing him closer and closer to his prey. Then movement. A faint ghost gray shape ahead, wings slender, tail narrow, almost delicate. A Zero, flying steady, unaware, trusting the night to protect it. Hargreaves slid beneath and behind the Japanese fighter, closing in until he could see the outline of the pilot's helmet under the canopy. The Zero drifted slightly left, correcting with a gentle touch, completely oblivious to the American machine stalking it from the void. For a moment, Gus hesitated. There was a surreal serenity to the scene. Two aircraft suspended over a sleeping ocean, sharing the same patch of sky but not the same fate. Then the Zero banked suddenly, as if sensing something, but too late. Hargreaves steadied his gun sight. Guns, guns, guns! The Corsair's 650 calibers erupted, shredding the quiet. Tracers speared into the Zero's fuselage, carving glowing lines into its paper-thin skin. The Japanese fighter snapped upward, trailing fire, then plunged into the darkness below, vanishing without even a flash on the horizon. Janny's voice crackled through the headset. "Splash one. My God, Gus. They'll never see us coming." No, they wouldn't. And that was the point. Back at Rabaul, Zero pilots would soon speak of invisible demons in the night. They would swear Allied fighters appeared out of nothing, struck without warning, and vanished before anyone could react. At first, Japanese flight officers dismissed these reports as nerves, superstition, fatigue. But the kill counts didn't lie. Something new was hunting them, something fast, patient, and utterly merciless in the dark. And tonight was only the beginning. The first wreckage washed ashore 3 days later. A reconnaissance patrol from the 81st Naval Garrison found it scattered across the coral flats east of Vunacanao, twisted aluminum fragments, charred spars, and a single wing panel marked with the faded red Hinomaru. What startled them wasn't that the aircraft had crashed. It was how it had crashed. No battle damage from the front, no sign of a dogfight, no bullet arcs across the nose or cowling. Everything was concentrated at the rear quarter, clean, precise, almost surgical. The officers at Lakanai Airfield gathered around the debris with grave, puzzled faces. Their Zero pilots were veterans, many trained in the fierce skies over China, some even survivors of the Coral Sea and Guadalcanal campaigns. They were used to combat. They were used to danger. But this looked like execution. Lieutenant CMDR Hachiro Miyazaki, one of Rabaul's most respected flight leaders, spoke first, his voice tight. This was a surprise attack, from behind. The pilot never saw it. Another officer gently nudged a scorched scrap of aluminum with his boot. "No one sees anything at night, but this is different." And it was, because more wrecks appeared. A second Zero found floating in Simpson Harbor, its pilot slumped over the controls, bullet holes stitched in from an unseen attacker. Then a third, embedded in jungle vines like some fallen white bird, again hit from the rear with brutal precision. Whispers began spreading in the barracks. The Americans have a new fighter. They stalk us in the dark. They fire before we even know they're there. Pilots grew uneasy. Some refused night assignments. Others insisted the Allies must have deployed a secret weapon, something impossibly fast, or armed with strange new guns, or guided by technology the Japanese did not understand. But command still clung to the comforting fiction that it was pilot error, or weather, or simple misfortune. That illusion shattered on a humid March night when a flight of 3 Zeros from the 204th Q took off from Tobara Airfield on a routine patrol. Only one returned. The surviving pilot, Ensign Kenji Okamoto, staggered out of his cockpit, pale and shaking. His story spilled out in fragments, breathless, terrified, almost delirious. He described a shape materializing behind his wingman as if the night itself had grown teeth. He saw tracers appear from empty darkness. He watched a Corsair, he was sure of it, dive past him at a speed he swore no Japanese aircraft could match. Black wings, he whispered to the ground crew. Bent wings, with eyes that see in the dark. It sounded insane. Until the intelligence reports arrived, Allied reconnaissance had captured blurry photos of something new on the airstrips at Green Island. A Corsair variant with odd protrusions on the wings, panels open where no gun port should be, long unfamiliar antennae glinting under tropical sun. Radio detection equipment, airborne radar. The realization hit Rabaul's command like a cold knife. The Americans weren't lucky. They weren't guessing. They were seeing in the dark. And the hunters weren't just passing through. They were coming again, and again, and again. What began as curiosity now spiraled into fear. Veteran pilots who once joked that the Corsair was clumsy, slow, unsuited to dogfights, now refused to underestimate it. Because this version of the Corsair didn't dogfight. It ambushed, and it killed. By mid-March, panic was creeping into the very heart of Japan's strongest bastion in the South Pacific. Flight schedules were rewritten. Night missions were cut back. Searchlights swept the sky endlessly, probing for ghosts. But deep down, everyone at Rabaul already knew the truth. Whatever stalked them at night wasn't a ghost. It was Hargreaves's hunters, and they were just getting started. The next big strike wasn't planned. It evolved, a silent convergence of timing, instinct, and the kind of predatory patience only night fighters understood. March 17, 1944. 23:42 hours, 20 miles southeast of Rabaul. Hargreaves flew with his cockpit lights dimmed until they were little more than faint red embers. The air was unusually still tonight, no turbulence, no cloud cover, just a vast, calm sheet of black stretching from horizon to horizon. Even the ocean below seemed to darken itself, as if trying to vanish from sight. Perfect conditions. Too perfect. Gus felt it first, not through the radar, but through a pilot's sixth sense, something sharpened by hundreds of hours in the Corsair's cockpit. A feeling like the air around him was holding its breath. Then the radar operator aboard the ground station broke the silence. Victor 2, we have multiple launches from Tabera. Repeat, multiple launches. 9, correction, 10 contacts ascending northwest. Possible bomber escort. Janney muttered, 10 at this hour. Hargreaves didn't answer. He was already throttling forward. The radar set inside the Corsair flickered to life. Faint pings, scattered, uncertain. Early radar wasn't precise. It was more like hunting in fog. But in Hargreaves's hands, it became a scalpel. He climbed fast, letting the night swallow any trace of exhaust glow. Above him, the stars vanished in a thickening haze. A thin, transparent cloud layer, just enough to give him concealment without blinding him. Janney breathed. We're in a sweet spot, Gus. They won't see us, but we'll see them. Minutes passed. The radar contacts drew closer. Then shapes? Dark silhouettes drifting overhead, almost blending with the sky. A tight formation, gliding smoothly along Rabaul's southern approach route. Zeros. And in their center, 2 twin-engine bombers likely headed for a night harassment run on Allied shipping lanes. The Japanese formation flew confidently, predictably. They believed the night belonged to them. They were wrong. Hargreaves angled his Corsair beneath the formation, matching speed, letting the cloud layer obscure him. From below, the Zero pilots saw nothing but darkness. But from his vantage point, their engine glow flickered like floating embers. He whispered, barely audible, even inside his own mask. Hold it! Hold it! Janney stayed tucked in tight, trusting Gus instinctively. He'd flown with him long enough to know that when Hargreaves went quiet, something deadly was about to happen. The moment came like a snapping wire. 2 Zeros drifted slightly apart to adjust spacing. That small gap, the length of a wingspan, was the opening. Hargreaves pulled up sharply. The Corsair burst through the cloud layer like a shark erupting from the depths. He materialized behind the trailing Zero, his guns already aligned. The Japanese pilot had no warning, no silhouette, no sound. Just death. Hargreaves fired a disciplined 1-second burst. The Zero exploded in a fan of flame and debris, lighting the underside of the formation with a brief orange flash. Panic erupted instantly. Pilots shouted over their radios. The formation split like a flock of startled birds, but the darkness betrayed them. Once they broke formation, they couldn't find each other again. Janney dove after A6M Zero, catching it in a hard turn and raking its tail with a burst that sent it spiraling into the sea. Above them, Hargreaves targeted the bombers. He closed in on the first one from below, letting the bomber's own exhaust outline its vulnerable belly. The gunner never saw him. Another short, ruthless burst, and the twin-engine aircraft lurched forward, trailing fire before dropping nose first into the clouds. The second bomber tried to escape by climbing. A fatal mistake. Climbing made it slower, predictable, exposed. Hargreaves rose beneath it, matching every move like a shadow glued to its skin. Then he fired. The bomber erupted in a fireball so bright it flashed across the cloud layer like lightning. Even Janney flinched at the sudden glare. The remaining Zeros fled, straight back toward Rabaul. But Hargreaves wasn't done. He switched off his gunsight light, killed every glow in his cockpit, and drifted downward into the thicker clouds, content to watch the chaos unfold from the dark. Above him, the panicked enemy pilot circled wildly, searching for the attacker that had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Some spiraled dangerously close to each other. Others nearly clipped treetops as they dove toward their airfields. Every one of them would return with the same terrified report. The Americans waited for us. They attacked from nowhere. They can see at night. But the most frightening detail was the one they couldn't articulate. The hunters didn't chase kills for glory. They hunted with precision, with patience, with purpose. And Hargreaves had just proven that night fighting wasn't an experiment anymore. It was dominance. A new fear settled over Rabaul that night, colder and more suffocating than any enemy bomb. Because now every Japanese pilot knew if they saw the Corsair, it was already too late. By late March, the fear inside Rabaul had a shape and a name. Corsair. Not the clumsy daylight brute they'd mocked months earlier, not the gull-winged monster they believed was too heavy, too slow, too crude to compete with the elegant Zero. No, this new Corsair was something else entirely. A hunter, a phantom, a machine that seemed fused to the night itself. The Japanese command did what all cornered forces do when reality starts to crush their old assumptions. They scrambled. Frantic meetings, rapid memos, half measures disguised as strategy. Anything to regain control? It began in the dimly lit operations room beneath Lakunai Airfield, where officers hunched over maps, their cigarettes burning down faster than their ideas. The room smelled of sweat, kerosene, and quiet panic. Los Hirsche EMD assure. Miyazaki slammed his palm onto the table hard enough to rattle the compass. This is impossible. The Americans cannot see us at night. They cannot. But they could, and everyone in the room knew it. Major Tomio Naito, one of Rabaul's senior night operations planners, pointed at the reports with a shaky hand. We are losing pilots who never even radio contact. No distress calls, no sightings. Just gone. The silence that followed was suffocating, because every officer understood what that meant. Their men weren't fighting back. They weren't even reacting. They were dying before they knew they were under attack. Something had to be done. Countermeasure Lesper 1. Flood the night with searchlights. The first idea was simple, almost primitive. Drown the sky in light. The anti-aircraft crews ringed Rabaul's airfields with a web of powerful searchlights. They swept back and forth across the night sky like pale blue swords, slicing through clouds, probing for shadows. But the American night fighters came low. They came fast. They attacked from angles the searchlights never reached. And more importantly, the searchlights turned the Zeros into perfect silhouettes. Targets. Countermeasure Nerd 2, blackout takeoffs. Next, the Japanese tried launching fighters without runway lights, using only handheld lanterns, shielded by metal plates to guide the pilots. Ground crews whispered hurried instructions. Pilots revved their engines in total darkness, trusting instinct and luck to get airborne. 3 aircraft crashed on takeoff the first night. 2 more clipped trees at the end of the runway. The plan was quietly abandoned. Countermeasure number 3, paint the Zeros black. Someone proposed painting an entire squadron matte black to vanish into the night. A dozen aircraft were hastily coated in soot-dark lacquer. It didn't help. Dark paint didn't matter when the enemy saw you through radar, not eyes. And worse, black aircraft were nearly invisible to each other. Mid-air collisions became a real threat. One pilot joked grimly, "We're safer fighting the Americans than flying near our own." No one laughed. Countermeasure number 4. New tactics. Climb high, spiral down. Finally, senior officers drafted a new defensive doctrine. Night fighters would climb to maximum altitude and slowly spiral downward, hoping their position above the enemy would give them an advantage. But the Corsairs had already adapted. Hargreaves' squadron simply climbed higher. Their powerful engines thrived in thin air. The Zeros, lightweight but fragile, began to stall near their ceiling. The advantage evaporated, and so did the morale. The breaking point came on April 4th. A group of 12 Zeros launched from Tobara on a night interception. Only half returned. And the survivors, terrified, exhausted, shaking, reported the same impossible sight. American fighters hovering above them, moving with purpose, tracking them even through cloud banks, firing the instant they turned. One pilot described it like this: "It felt like someone was reading our thoughts." Another muttered, "They are not airplanes, they are shadows." And in the officers' barracks later that night, a young ensign whispered the one fear no one wanted to voice aloud. What if the war has changed, and we are still fighting the old one? By morning, even the most senior commanders could no longer deny the truth. The Americans had found a new way to wage war. A way Japan had no counter for, a way that flipped the balance of power with brutal, silent efficiency. And at the center of this nightmare, a calm, meticulous Marine major named William Gus Hargreaves was refining his tactics even further. Because he knew something the Japanese didn't. Night warfare wasn't a phase. It was the future. And he was just getting started. April 9th, 1944. 01:13 hours. Over the Solomon Sea, 30 miles southwest of Rabaul. The sky was moonless, the kind of darkness that swallows even sound. You could stretch out your hand inside the cockpit and barely see your glove. But Gus Hargreaves, flew as if he could see everything, because in a way, he could. His F4U Corsair glided silently at 12,000 feet, engine throttled back, prop turning so smooth it felt like drifting. The only illumination came from the soft, ghostly glow of the radar screen. A single blip pulsed at the far edge, then another, and a third. 3 contacts bearing 143 Angels 12, the ground controller murmured in his ear. Looks like a scout flight. Scout flights meant trouble. Scouts usually preceded bomber runs or large formations repositioning. If these 3 got home, they'd relay intel on Allied ship movements. That could cost lives. Not tonight. Janney was tucked in tight on Hargreaves's right. Even in pitch black, Gus could feel his wingman there. A quiet presence, steady as an anchor. "Same plan?" Janney whispered. "My same plan," Gus replied. "Up the middle, you take the trailer." They climbed together, slicing through the dark. The radar pings grew sharper, closer, more confident. Early radar was crude, but in the hands of a veteran like Hargreaves, it became a sixth sense. He no longer needed to check the scope. He felt distance the way a hunter feels the heartbeat of prey. At 14,000 feet, the wind changed. A faint tremor in the Corsair's frame. Then, there, shapes ahead, darker than the night around them. 3 Zeros cruising in tight formation, unaware they were being dissected by invisible eyes. Hargreaves leveled off, matched their speed, slipped beneath their wake turbulence. He timed his attack with the precision of a surgeon. 1 breath, 2. Then he pulled the Corsair up into position directly behind the lead Zero. From this close, he could see the Japanese aircraft's exhaust flickering with each piston stroke. He could see the slight tilt of the pilot's head, could almost imagine his breathing. The distance closed to 50 yards. Hargreaves squeezed the trigger. 6 Browning .50 calibers spat fire, bright, violent streaks that ripped through the night. The tracers tore into the Zero's fuselage, slicing across its belly and into the wing root. The aircraft shuddered violently, then pitched downward into a steep, flaming dive. The other 2 Zeros panicked. One broke right. One dove away. Janney already had the trailer lined up. A short burst, clean, surgical, and the second Zero disintegrated into spinning fragments. The last pilot dove like a stone, rolling violently, trying anything to break pursuit. His silhouette vanished into the blackness below, swallowed by clouds. For 10 long seconds, nothing. Then Hargreaves whispered, "Janny, drop to Angels 8. I'm going after him." He pushed the Corsair forward, nose down. The aircraft plunged through the cloud layer, moisture streaking across the canopy. The altimeter spun downward. Then, a faint movement, a jitter of engine glow, a dark V-shape emerging from the murk, maybe 500 yards ahead. The last Zero was running for home. Gus didn't rush. He didn't fire blindly. He closed the distance inch by inch, letting the radar confirm what his instincts already knew. He came in low and slightly left, an angle no Japanese pilot was trained to defend. When he fired, the tracers stitched upward across the Zero's fuselage, catching the wing tank. A burst of white fire erupted, illuminating the clouds with a sudden, haunting glow. For a second, both aircraft flew through the fiery halo, Corsair chasing Zero through its own burning trail. Then the flames thinned. The Zero vanished into a downward spiral, and the sky went quiet again. Janny's voice crackled through the static. 3 down. Gus, you realize what this means, right? Hargreaves didn't answer immediately. He looked out into the empty night, the calm, dark ocean below, the silent stars overhead, the fading smoke trail drifting behind him. He finally said, "It means they're learning we own the darkness." But that wasn't the whole truth. What it really meant, what Rabaul would understand within hours, was something far more terrifying. Their scouts had been wiped out before they knew the enemy was near. Their night defenses had failed. Their pilots were no longer safe in the one element they once controlled. The psychological blow was catastrophic. By dawn, Japanese officers at Rabaul began to speak of the American Corsair night fighters in hushed tones. Not as aircraft, not even as enemies, but as predators, creatures of the dark, beings that struck without warning, without mercy, without being seen. And soon rumors began spreading that one particular pilot, a calm, calculating major with a hunter's patience, was leading them. A shadow with a name, Hargreaves, and Rabaul would soon learn he wasn't even finished yet. April 22nd, 1944. 047 hours. The southern rim of Rabaul burned faintly in the distance, glowing orange where fires from earlier raids still smoldered in the jungle canopy. But up here, at 16,000 feet, the world was quiet. Too quiet. Maj Gus Hargreaves didn't like it. Silence meant the enemy was planning something. His radar screen pulsed with the slow, hypnotic sweep of the antenna. Nothing yet. Just empty static. Janny breathed steadily over the intercom, waiting, scanning the darkness with a tension that only night fighters understood. Then, a crackle in the headset. "Vector control to Victor 2. We've got movement, a lot of it." Gus straightened in his seat. "How many?" he asked. There was a pause, and when the controller answered, his voice lacked its usual calm. "Too many to count." The radar picture didn't lie. Dozens of contacts were lifting off from Rabaul's northern fields, Tobera, Vunakanau, Lakunai. A massive surge of aircraft, climbing, spreading out, forming a wide arc. It wasn't a patrol, it wasn't an escort, it was something far more desperate. Janny whispered, "Are they sweeping the sky for us?" "No." Hargreaves' voice was low, controlled. "They're trying to take back the night." This was it, the moment Japanese command finally committed everything they had to break the American night hunters. A coordinated sweep. Every available Zero airborne, every pilot briefed to fly erratically, change altitude constantly, and hunt in pairs rather than alone. A trap intended to smother Hargreaves' squadron with sheer numbers and chaos. But they didn't understand the truth. Chaos was where the night fighters thrived. Hargreaves opened his throttle, and the Corsair surged upward. The cockpit vibrated, engine straining, prop biting harder into the cold upper air. At 18,000 feet, the humid Pacific atmosphere thinned, sharpening the stars into icy pinpoints. Then the radar lit up. 4 blips, then 6, then 12, an entire wave moving in a staggered climb. "Janny, stack left. We'll roll over the top." They approached the formation inverted. flying belly up to keep their silhouettes hidden against the dark ocean below. It was a dangerous maneuver, disorienting, dizzying, but perfect for ambush. As they crossed above the Japanese fighters, Hargreaves rolled upright. The sky below blossomed with engine glow, dozens of small orange flickers drifting in tight pairs and triplets. Zeros, so many zeros, and none of them looking up. The first pass was merciless. Hargreaves dove like a falling star, slashing past the top element of the formation. He fired a tight burst, short, controlled, professional. A Zero burst into flame before its pilot even knew someone was above him. Janney followed, carving through the formation like a scalpel, catching a second Zero mid-turn. The Japanese formation convulsed instantly, breaking apart like frightened fish scattering from a shark. "Break, break! American fighters above us! Above us!" Voices screamed over the Japanese radio net. But the night betrayed them. The moment the formation split, the Zeros vanished into the dark, and so did their ability to help one another. Hargreaves's radar screen erupted into motion, dots scattering, diving, spiraling, fleeing. He didn't chase blindly. He hunted. He picked the highest contact, an experienced pilot trying to regain altitude, and closed in behind him. The Zero climbed in a desperate wobbling arc, barely maintaining lift at this thin altitude. The Corsair didn't struggle. Its massive engine thrived in cold air. Hargreaves matched speed, lined up the shot, fired. The tracers cut the Zero's tail clean off. The fighter spun into a flat, helpless disk, falling through the night like a dropped coin. Below, the sky dissolved into madness. Zeros collided in the dark. Others dove so low they vanished into jungle valleys, smashing into unseen ridges. Searchlights stabbed wildly, illuminating nothing but confusion and fear. And the Americans? They were ghosts. Hargreaves and Janney struck over and over. Short bursts, single kills, no wasted ammo. Their Corsairs vanished between hits, using cloud cover like camouflage, slipping away before the Japanese even finished shouting warnings. By Euro 129, the sweep was broken. By Euro 140, it was a massacre. And by 0210, the night sky above Rabaul was empty again, except for two Corsairs gliding in wide circles, watching the last burning fragments drift toward the dark ocean. Janney's voice finally came over the radio, quiet, almost reverent. "We just broke them, Gus." Hargreaves didn't respond right away. He stared into the night, the silent sky that, for the first time in years, belonged not to the Zero, but to the Corsair. He finally said in a calm, almost tired tone, "The night is ours now." Back in Rabaul, the returning Japanese pilots landed with haunted eyes. They spoke of an enemy that attacked from above, below, beside, always unseen, always precise, always there. Some pilots refused to fly night missions again. Others demanded new tactics, new planes, new technology. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The balance of power had shifted, and it would never shift back. Because on that April night, Hargreaves didn't just win a battle. He ended an era, 2,300 hours. The moon had vanished behind a bank of storm clouds, leaving the Solomon Sea ink black and bottomless. At 9,000 feet, the F4U night fighters flew in a loose predatory line, three shadows gliding through a larger shadow. Inside the lead Corsair, Major Gus Hargreaves adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the dim green scope. Only the faint hum of the AN/APS-6 radar filled the cockpit. No engine roar, no radio chatter, only anticipation, the kind that sits behind your ribs and waits. Below, Rabaul burned quietly, not from bombs tonight, but from fear. Japanese commanders had doubled their nightcap rotations, ordered new dispersal tactics, even attempted experimental flare traps. None of it was working. The night hunters kept coming, and every time, someone didn't return to base. But it wasn't usually the Corsairs. Gus clicked his mic. "Raven lead to Raven 2, you seeing this?" A small, flickering blip materialized on the right edge of his scope. Then another. Then 6 more. A patrol of Zeros flying staggered, but unfocused, nervous, radiating uncertainty. Word had spread across the Japanese air groups. The Americans had ghosts in the sky, ghosts with bent wings, ghosts that saw in the dark. Gus eased his throttle forward. "You take the left 3, he whispered. I'll introduce myself to the rest." The Corsair surged ahead, nose dipping slightly as he slid below the Japanese formation, invisible against the starless sea. You could almost feel the tension tightening, like a rope. 50 seconds. 30. 15. He pulled the stick. The F4U rose like a breaching whale, silent, sudden, monstrous. Its prop wash rippled through the humid night as the guns blinked alive. 650 caliber streams punched upward into the belly of the lead Zero. The fighter disintegrated in a burst of fire and sheet metal, its fragments trailing toward the dark ocean. Before the others could react, Raven 2 and Raven 3 erupted from the opposite side. Tracers tore across the formation in crisscrossed streaks of gold. 3 more Zeros spiraled down, their pilots never locating the attackers in the pitch-black chaos. The remaining Japanese pilots panicked, pulling away, climbing, diving, scattering, like startled birds. It didn't matter. The Corsairs were already repositioning for a second pass. Below, across the rooftops of Rabaul, anti-aircraft crews scrambled to man their turrets. Officers shouted contradictory orders. A single question echoed through the confusion. How were the Americans doing this? Above the blazing harbor, Gus banked left, lining up his next target. He exhaled slowly. Another Zero filled his sight reticle, unaware of the dark-winged shape stalking it. And then his radar screen fizzled. Static. A soft, rising whine. The first failure he'd ever seen in the APS-6. Not now. Not tonight. His Corsair dipped slightly as he tapped the casing, trying to coax the radar back to life. Nothing. Only the flat hiss of an electronic heartbeat gone still. Out of the corner of his eye, Gus caught movement. A dim silhouette sliding into position behind him. Too close, too quiet. A Zero. One pilot who hadn't panicked. One who had followed the muzzle flashes instead of running from them. It was on his tail. Closing fast. Gus's breath froze. His thumb hovered over the trigger. He tightened his harness, and then the Zero fired the first burst. Tracers streaked past his right wingtip, dangerously close. Gus rolled hard left, diving toward the dark ocean below. The Japanese pilot stayed glued to him. Every maneuver, every twist, every counter-turn. This one wasn't afraid. This one was hunting back. Gus gritted his teeth. "So, you want a real fight," he muttered. "Come get it." His Corsair dropped into the black void beneath the clouds. The Zero followed. 2 predators plummeting into darkness, one guided by instinct, the other by sheer will. But only one could survive the drop. The ocean below was a black sheet, so vast it seemed endless, so dark it felt as if the air itself had swallowed the world. Hargreaves's Corsair carved through it like a knife, the hum of the Pratt & Whitney radial engine vibrating through every fiber of the cockpit. His heartbeat matched the pulse of the machine. Behind him, the Zero stayed glued, its engine whining, a predator shadowing a predator. The Japanese pilot wasn't panicked. He wasn't fleeing. He was calculating, adjusting, anticipating. "You've got courage," Gus muttered under his breath, "or recklessness." He rolled left, the Corsair snapping through a steep bank. The Zero mirrored him perfectly, wings aligned, engine screaming, tracers glinting briefly in the faint cloud layer. Every movement was mirrored, every reaction predicted. Hargreaves's mind raced faster than his aircraft. Years of dogfighting, months of night operations, hundreds of kills, but nothing quite like this. The Corsair dipped into a shallow dive, picking up speed. The Zero followed. Then a sudden, violent pull. Hargreaves rolled sharply into a split S maneuver, shedding altitude, reversing direction. The Zero overcommitted. Its wings groaned under the strain. Tracers streaked past. Gus leveled out beneath the enemy fighter, closing the distance. His gun sight tracked the thin outline of the Zero's tail. One burst, short, controlled, deadly. Sheets of tracer fire tore through the night. The Zero shuddered violently, smoke curling from the engine cowling. But the pilot stayed in the fight, banking sharply to escape. Hargreaves gritted his teeth, persistent, intelligent, dangerous. The duel continued. Roll, dive, climb, roll again. Over waves, over clouds, sometimes invisible, sometimes catching the faintest glint of starlight. Off fuselage. Neither would make a mistake. Neither could relax, neither wanted to surrender. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Each maneuver a question, each response an answer. Finally, Hargreaves saw the opening. The Zero overextended in a tight turn, banking too sharply near stall speed. Gus leveled his Corsair, lined up the shot carefully, and fired a 2-second burst. The tracers hit the Zero's engine, cowling, then the fuselage. Flames erupted, trailing behind the fighter as it began a downward spiral. The Japanese pilot fought to pull up, but it was too late. The Corsair lifted, engine roaring, and watched the Zero vanish into the blackness below, swallowed by sea and shadow. Janny's voice crackled through the radio. "Gus, are you still with me? That was insane." Gus exhaled slowly, staring at the darkness where the enemy had been. "Yes," he replied, "still here, but they're learning." For the first time, Hargreaves felt the night as it truly was, alive, hungry, and full of danger, not just for the enemy, but for him and every pilot who trusted it. Yet, for all its threat, the night now belonged to him and his squadron. Every sortie, every kill, every maneuver had carved a territory no enemy could claim without consequence. And far below, in Rabaul, the Japanese pilots whispered in fear. Ghosts in the dark, invisible and unstoppable. A single name growing louder with every word. Hargreaves. Tonight, one pilot had survived, one had learned, and a legend had been born. By dawn, the night's chaos had left a mark far beyond the clouds over Rabaul. April 23, 1944. In the command bunker beneath Tobara Airfield, Japanese officers shuffled maps and reports, their faces pale with exhaustion. The radio crackled with fragmented transmissions from returning pilots, some still trembling, some simply silent, unable to articulate what had happened. There were Americans everywhere, one pilot whispered. They appeared, they struck, then vanished. I don't know where they came from. Ultin CMDR. Miyazaki slammed a fist onto the table, shaking the dust from the maps. Impossible! We had numbers, we had altitude, we had experience. Why are they still alive? Experience meant nothing when the enemy redefined the rules of the game. The Japanese had trained to fight in darkness as best they could, but the Corsair, bent-winged and clumsy only in rumor, had proven otherwise. It had adapted to the night, to radar, to every defensive maneuver. It had become an instrument of fear. Reports began to arrive from other airfields. Stories repeated themselves with growing panic. Pilots disappearing before reaching engagement range. Formations breaking apart under invisible attacks. Glowing trails of tracer fire tearing through the black. By mid-morning, the name Hargreaves had spread from pilot to pilot, whispered in reverence and terror. A single major with a squadron of night fighters had shattered the myth of invincibility the Zero had carried for years. Even among the Allied forces his reputation grew. Pilots spoke of the black wings of death, Corsairs that hunted without warning, precise and patient, returning home without a scratch. Commanders began shifting strategy, realizing night operations were no longer experimental, they were essential. Back at Green Island, Hargreaves inspected his Corsair, the early morning sun glinting off the bent wings. His squadron gathered nearby, faces still shadowed from the dark hours just past. Janny approached, handing him a coffee cup, voice low. "Gus, how do you do it? Every night, every sortie, you make it look inevitable." Hargreaves smiled faintly, exhausted but calm. "You don't do it alone," he said. "You let the plane do its work, you let the radar guide you, and you trust the night. It's not about being faster. It's about being ready, patient, and relentless." The men nodded. They had learned it firsthand, and the Japanese pilots would soon learn it too, the hard way. Across the Pacific, intelligence analysts in Tokyo received fragments of Allied reports. They recorded losses at night. They noted the unexpected. They began trying to formulate countermeasures. But every step lagged behind the reality Hargreaves had created in the sky. The Corsair was no longer clumsy. The night was no longer neutral. And the Zeros were no longer kings. Hargreaves leaned back, eyes on the horizon where the sun began to rise. The day offered calm, but he knew the night would return. And when it did, he would be ready. Because in the darkness, he had become legend. And legends don't just survive, they hunt.